Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Radia. I'm the Associate Director of Technology Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We're a public interest organization dedicated to advancing individual liberty and free markets. Today we're talking about encryption. There is a series of policy challenges to this technology, which, as we'll discuss, threatens in some respects our cybersecurity, our privacy, and our liberty. We have a distinguished lineup of experts to discuss various aspects of this topic. We have folks with backgrounds in law, computer science, public policy. First, we have Ryan Hagemann. He is the Civil Liberties Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. He formerly was a fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We also have Amie Stepanovich. She is the U.S. Policy Manager at Access. It's an international human rights organization that defends and extends digital rights of users at risk throughout the world. She previously directed the Domestic Surveillance Project at the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Finally, we have Jonathan Mayer. He is a graduate fellow at Stanford University with backgrounds in law and computer science. He is known for, among other things, co-developing the Do Not Track HTTP header standard. The reason we're talking about encryption today is because over the last year or so, some top officials in the US government and in other governments have been mounting a push to place various limitations or encourage companies to place limitations on encryption technology that, as I said, is used widely today and will only continue to be used more widely in the future for a variety of beneficial business models, technologies, and so forth. So before we get into the specific policy issues that encryption faces today, Jonathan, if you want to just briefly discuss what do we talk about when we say encryption? To what extent is it used? How is it used? How might it be used in ways that we don't always appreciate or realize? And how is it affecting the way that we interact with technology?
I'd like to begin with a just high-level technical sketch of three different applications of encryption that are slightly different and have differing security properties that are relevant to the policy debate. So the first kind is messaging encryption, so it's a message between some users. The second kind is storage encryption, so that's some data that's sitting around on a device. And then the last, transport encryption. And that's a data that's moving between a user and some service provider. The cloud is kind of the hip term, I guess. So let me start with messaging encryption. The specific issue that's garnered interest from the law enforcement intelligence communities is the growing use of end-to-end secure messaging. It's a specific type of security guaranteed through encryption, such that only the sender and recipient of a message can read that message. So anyone who sees the message fly by has no idea what's in it. And that includes any companies that are helping move the message along. Any telecoms, any cloud service providers, they just don't know what's in it. Probably the best, the most widely used example of messaging encryption that's end-to-end secure is Apple's iMessage. So you know how you have like blue bubble friends and green bubble friends? When you message a blue bubble friend, that message is end-to-end secure. Even Apple can't read the message. So that's messaging encryption. The second area I wanted to touch on is storage encryption. So that's data at rest. And the idea there is to guarantee that only the owner of a device can unlock that device and get at the data that's stored on it. A very common example is iOS disk encryption. So now by default, every iOS device, when you set it up, iPhone, iPad, iPod Touch, gets encrypted. To unlock it, you either need the owner's fingerprint or some PIN code. I believe it's now 6 digits by default. And so if you don't have that, the data on the device just looks like gibberish. And even if you have Apple's help, the data on the device looks like gibberish. So that's storage encryption. Last, there's transport encryption. That's moving data between a user and a cloud service. So for instance, you see the green lock icon in your web browser a lot when you're using Gmail. That's encryption between you and Google. So anyone who's in the position of a telecom, sitting on your wireless network, they can't read the data going between your computer and Google. But Google does get the data, right? It's intended for them. They can read the whatever it is you send, whether it's an email, whether it's a photo or some text you're storing, and that's the architecture of their service. So that is encryption, but it's a different sort of encryption. And the key distinction for policy purposes, where I want to leave things with this high-level technical sketch, is transport encryption is compatible with law enforcement access and intelligence access. Law enforcement or intelligence agency will just serve Google with the appropriate legal process, and they'll hand over the data. For end-to-end secure messaging or secure storage, there is no form of legal process that can compel assistance. Right? You can have the most draconian-looking warrant walk in, and the company says, "Sorry, we have no technical means of helping you." And so that's what's prompted some concern from law enforcement and intelligence that this technology could frustrate their investigations.
Thank you. So, Ryan, could you talk about the reasons we're discussing encryption today here on Capitol Hill, specifically individuals like FBI Director James Comey and others who have both privately and publicly urged companies to change their technology so that, as Jonathan mentioned, they can, in fact, comply with a warrant to decrypt a user's data? What's the case against the sort of encryption that is increasingly being used both in transport and on devices? Who's making the case? What are the implications or alleged implications of the growth of encryption?
Thank you to Ryan and to the Competitive Enterprise Institute for hosting us here today. I guess let's go back to the 1990s very briefly. We had something that is in retrospect referred to as the crypto wars, which was waged against, there were many different components to this, but the primary impetus for policy purposes back then was law enforcement and the Clinton administration were attempting to install Clipper chips in all the phones in this country, and there was a lot of pushback, and ultimately the proposal was defeated. Ultimately, export controls, which used to be mandated for encryption, were relaxed. For those of you who don't know, in the early 1990s, encryption was actually technically classified as a munition by the United States government and therefore was not allowed to be exported, quote unquote. The advent of the internet and a number of legal challenges changed the policy disposition in this space, and ever since about 1999, encryption has been relatively off the radar of lawmakers and policy folks. In recent years, FBI Director James Comey and others in government, in high positions in government, have been arguing that they are beginning to encounter a, quote, going dark problem, whereby certain areas of the internet and certain communications that they were attempting to read were inaccessible. Now, the big problem with the going dark framework that Mr. Comey has been using over the last few years is it's essentially attempting to produce a solution to a problem that doesn't really exist. And the United States Department of Justice's own statistics back this up. In 2014, 3,554 federal and state wiretap orders were issued by judges. In only 25 of those cases was encryption even encountered, and in only 4 of those cases was the encryption unbreakable. So far from being an imminent threat to the security of the United States, encryption and the protocols that underline it are, in fact, good. If you go to an ATM to take out money, if you have the online banking app that allows you to take a picture of your check and send the information to your bank, all of these types of services are utilizing encryption. Now, the problem with attempting to, as the director would like to do, install a, quote, backdoor, or as they've been calling it recently, a front door, courtesy Admiral Mike Rogers over at the NSA, the problem with attempting to install these technical vulnerabilities in encryption is it assumes that only the good guys can actually get access to encrypted communications. The reality, though, is that code is neutral. It isn't assessing whether or not the individual who is attempting to crack into the particular system is a good guy, quote unquote, or a bad guy, quote unquote. So what ends up happening is we have a regime where, or what would end up happening if Mr. Comey and others got their way, is we would essentially have a regime where all encryption everywhere is essentially vulnerable to access by anyone with the requisite technical skill sets. Now, from a public policy standpoint, we constantly have to assess the costs and benefits of any action that we undertake. And I am currently in the process of finalizing a paper that attempts to quantify the benefits associated with encryption, and the results are pretty staggering, quite frankly. The modern economy is built on the internet. It is built on digital flows of information, and the only reason that we had seen the explosive growth in internet services over the past quarter century is a result of the underlying architecture of the internet and the use of strong encryption in things ranging from bank-to-bank transfers. Every time you go on Amazon and you buy something, that little green lock in the upper left-hand corner and that S at the end of HTTP, that's telling you that this is a secure connection and no one can break it. And consumers responded to that positively. The internet ecosystem is built on trust, and any attempt by the government to deflate that trust by mandating the installation of these backdoors into encryption protocols is not only going to harm individual users and their financial and personal identifiable information. It's going to harm the U.S. economy, and it's going to harm the global economy.
I'd like to finish setting the stage by talking briefly about the international implications of the issue. Back in the 1980s, the Reagan administration actually funded the deployment, the availability of copy machines in the Soviet Union to help political dissidents distribute information and communicate in ways that the government would have preferred they not. Today, the State Department in the United States has funded a variety of initiatives that affect global dissidents, but in the technological sense, through things like the Onion Router, also known as Tor. Amie, do you want to talk about the uses of encryption globally in countries that perhaps have fewer liberties than we do, and how what the United States government does about encryption affects what happens in those countries?
Sure. I want to start with, encryption is a really strange word, and it's actually really hard for people to access the term encryption. It seems like something the NSA does, and then other spy agencies try to break it. But the great thing is that people interact with encryption every single day, and people don't necessarily know that they're interacting with encryption. It happens in our technology seamlessly in a lot of cases. It protects us as we communicate and interact online with our banks or our friends. And so we end up in this situation where when you use the term encryption, people don't get it, but you can use the term security. And that's something that you can access. You understand when you're doing something online and it's secure versus when you're doing something online and another party may be able to break into it. And so what we're really talking here is about your ability to stay secure online, as opposed to any vague or unreally reachable notion of encryption or crypto. That said, a lot of the things that can undermine encryption aren't only backdoors. There's a lot of conversation about backdoors. This is not the only proposal. These are not the only proposals that we're seeing take place, not in the US and not around the world. So here we're talking about backdoors and vulnerabilities, something that's built into your technologies or your tools that could allow somebody to access it without your knowledge. But it's also key escrow. When you encrypt something, it's encrypted with a key. And the fact that maybe all of those keys can be put into a really large database. And so if the government wants to get at the key, that they can access that key without necessarily having to break into the encryption otherwise. We're talking about exceptional access, which means that the governments are going to go to the companies and say, please don't use anything that's too secure. You hear a lot of time people in the FBI, people in the NSA say, we really want you to use strong encryption. But we don't want you to use encryption that's too strong because then we won't be able to get access to it. So we call that exceptional access. And then the last way that that governments have been talking about this is by actually undermining the standards that your encryption is built upon. And a few words about that. This is what happened when the U.S. tried to mandate that they would not export, they would only be able to export certain types of encryption. And that's what Ryan talked about having happened in the 90s. The weird thing about that is the proposal went away. We are now able to export any encryption we want, but we are still feeling the effects of even that short-term policy. Many of you might have heard earlier this year that there is a bug that was released called the Freak bug. The Freak bug is a direct result of the US policies in the 90s to only export a certain strength of encryption and trying to mandate that only encryption that's so strong could be sent outside of the country. So these are not things that you can mandate and then go away and you won't feel the repercussions of them later on. They can come back years, sometimes decades later. The reason that we say that this is a global problem, the US is not the only country where you're hearing governments want to undermine encryption. Perhaps the most vocal country where you're hearing this is in the United Kingdom, where David Cameron, who's the Prime Minister, has said that he wants to maintain law enforcement access in order to combat terrorism, public safety, kind of the usual buzzwords that you hear when you talk about national security issues. The Chinese government has done quite a bit on the encryption issue. The Indian government actually recently published a document on encryption policy that was incredibly draconian, would have allowed a company to provide you with encryption, but would have required that company to keep a plain text version of all encrypted communications for a period identified by statute. So a data retention provision along with a mandated decryption provision. The immediate response to this policy, it was a draft policy when it was published. They were seeking comments on it. The comments that were provided immediately actually made them withdraw it within, I think, 48 hours. They said, this isn't even our draft policy anymore. We're going to go back and write a new draft policy, and we'll publish that, and we'll accept comments on that. But they are still looking at how to do encryption policy in a way that may undermine security. Any of these countries, if they put something into place, because the internet is the internet and doesn't really represent or recognize boundaries or borders the way that traditional technologies and governments do, means that any country that puts into place restrictions or backdoors or vulnerabilities could have this huge, massive global effect. In the UK, where we're seeing the biggest possibility for this happening, they actually have an extraterritoriality provision that says that any law that they pass has application on any company that does business within the UK. So basically, because the internet is accessible from the United Kingdom, all internet companies are going to have to comply with the UK's law. If the UK says that vulnerabilities are required, all internet companies are going to have to build vulnerabilities. That creates this weird Hobson's choice. Is an internet company going to create vulnerabilities that only work within the United Kingdom, meaning they have to service two different products or services because they have one for the UK and one for the rest of the world? That's incredibly expensive. Or are they going to produce technologies, a single tool that everybody in the world will use and everybody in the world will have to be made vulnerable by the fact that they're building this in because of one government's requirement? It's really hard, I will say, to fight against some of those policies. Access is a global organization. We have 7 offices located all around the world. We do interact with all of these policies as they are proposed. Because the White House has not yet made a proactive statement that says that it will not seek to undermine encryption. They have said that they will not seek legislation right now. That is the official talking point by FBI Director James Comey. But there's not been a proactive statement made yet. There is a huge push right now for the White House to make a proactive statement to say that it won't undermine encryption. Access and 47 of our closest partners and allies in civil society and in the corporate world, including Dropbox, Mozilla, LinkedIn, several other companies, have been launching a site called safecrypto.org. It has over 85,000 signatures now to go to the White House to ask for a statement. It uses the White House's own We the People API. So once we hit 100,000, the White House has to make some statement. So we are trying to push the White House to make a positive statement that would allow us to do more effective advocacy in other countries so we can prevent these vulnerabilities from taking place overseas as well as in the United States.
many new cloud-based services that enable you to store your data remotely so you can access it wherever you are on any device are adopting what has been called a zero-knowledge approach, whereby the plaintext data isn't sitting on their server in a way that they can access, where they can respond to a warrant and hand it over to law enforcement, perhaps without notifying the user, but rather the provider increasingly often holds the data in encrypted form, where the key is held by the user and is not known to the provider. Jonathan, as these services have taken off, even though we've perhaps heard more about devices, at least from government officials in the US, of course, these cloud-based services where the provider cannot decrypt the data are another point of scrutiny. What's the problem with the approach that some have advocated, such as the Washington Post editorial last year that called for a golden key, or this front door approach? Why can't that work? Why can't that allow us to get the security we want while ensuring law enforcement can get the access it needs?
So the fundamental technical challenge is ensuring the government can get access to data, whether it's flying by on a network or sitting at rest, with proper legal process, and yet making sure someone who doesn't have that proper legal process, who isn't the government, can't get at the data. And building in that mechanism for government access as a technical matter just necessarily introduces new security risks. It's a new avenue of access to data. And you have to trust that the backdoor for accessing that data will be constructed properly and locked tight. So by constructed properly, what I mean is building a backdoor necessarily introduces complexity into a software system. And complexity has long been understood to be the enemy of security in the computer security field. To the extent you can simplify software, you reduce the likelihood that there are security risks. And so getting a backdoor right is tricky. And in particular, even if we can expect companies like Google or Apple, which have the engineering resources to build one of these things correctly to get it right, it's quite the imposition for a small startup that now has to take limited engineering resources and build this mechanism in a way that's secure. Getting security is tough enough for small companies. So that's the complexity part. That part about making sure it's locked tight, what I mean is there's a risk of someone coming in through the back door that's not the vendor, that's not law enforcement. The vendor could be compromised. Many vendors of software products and hardware products have been compromised. Similarly, there are risks of insider issues, for instance, rogue employees. And there is no technical means of making sure those things don't happen. And in fact, building a backdoor or a secure golden key or a front door, whatever euphemism one chooses, is by design creating a very attractive target for all of the sorts of risks that already exist. It's a concentrated point for accessing user data. So that's the sort of fundamental difficulty. And I want to close by noting that it's not a hypothetical difficulty in the slightest. In instances where there have been law enforcement portals built for access to data, they have been attacked and they have been breached. So for instance, Greece has a law enforcement portal for accessing its telecommunications infrastructure. And it turned out someone, possibly a nation state, had been listening into individual cell phone calls for quite some time, including members of their parliament. In the Bahamas, it's been leaked that it appears the United States government had access to a law enforcement telecom portal. Google's law enforcement portal was breached, quite possibly by the Chinese government for access to user data. So there's kind of the concentrated risk problem. It's not a hypothetical. In terms of risks of compromise not being a hypothetical, again, loads of companies have had their keys and other material for authenticating themselves, for pushing out updates, for getting at data compromised. And last, I want to note on the complexity issue, amplifying Amy's point, we have seen examples already of where adding complexity to protocols long after the fact had security repercussions. So some of the most recent issues with transport security between you and Google, between you and your bank, have arisen because of core decisions back in the 90s that increased the necessary complexity of cryptographic protocols. So there are real security problems here, and they are not hypothetical security problems.
Ryan, your organization recently joined with several others in sending a coalition letter to the president urging him to reject proposals to insist on the weakening of encryption. I believe your letter referred to encryption as the Second Amendment for the digital age. Can you unpack that argument and address why those who have a free market orientation should in particular care about allowing encryption to remain robust and deployed by companies without governmental restrictions?
Certainly. So just full disclosure, we did not come up with the expression encryption is the Second Amendment of the internet. That, I believe, that honor goes to Sunday Euclides over at Golden Frog. He is the CEO and president over there and wrote an op-ed entitled Encryption is the Second Amendment for the Internet. So we lovingly copied his wording. The intent with that letter was to try to show conservatives and libertarians who have by and large hitherto been relatively disengaged from the tech policy space. Of course, with notable exceptions. My friend Mr. Radia and CEI are engaged in this space, as are organizations such as Tech Freedom, the R Street Institute, and FreedomWorks. But that's about it when you look at the right side of the aisle. Conservatives, by and large, have ignored the fact that without encryption, we would not have seen the explosive economic growth that has resulted from the digital age over the last 25, 30 years. And so the idea of messaging this as the Second Amendment for the internet is basically trying to explain to people, look, if you support the Second Amendment as it stands, if you support the right to own a weapon in order to defend yourself from those who would do you harm, then encryption is pretty much the perfect tool for you online. It has no offensive capabilities. It simply exists as essentially a barrier between you and those who would like to steal your financial information. If you're a traveling businessman, try to steal your company's trade secrets, which, by the way, as a slight side note, despite all the hullabaloo around FBI Director Comey's contention that we are going dark and we need security vulnerabilities installed in our encryption protocols, the FBI's own literature that it gives out to businessmen traveling abroad specifically says that they should utilize the strongest form of encryption that they possibly can. And I think what we're seeing this a lot, I think, in government these days in the post-Snowden world. On the one hand, the FBI has the charge of protecting American citizens here at home, and the NSA has the charge of protecting Americans by basically being engaged overseas. But in both situations, you're seeing a little bit of policy schizophrenia in these organizations as they realize, hey, we'd really like to get a little bit more data because, it's the digital age and we don't really want to go through that whole, human intelligence thing that we've been doing for the last couple hundred years. So let's just ask for some security vulnerabilities. This is troubling, specifically for the NSA for two reasons. The NSA's mission is, one, to essentially, they're basically charged with collecting information from foreigners as a means of protecting Americans. But their other charge is also, and you'll excuse me, my memory is not what it once was, but their other mission is providing the National Institute of Standards and Technology with, quote, technical guidelines and trusted technology used in cost-effective systems for protecting sensitive computer data. And yet, in the wake of Edward Snowden's revelations, we now realize that through a number of programs he revealed, most notably the Bull Run program, that the NSA has actually been specifically engaged in weakening encryption standards and passing along to NIST all types of suggestions for incorporating encryption protocols that aren't actually as secure as they should be. So I think part of the policy schizophrenia we're seeing in this space is a lot of different organizations where mission creep has essentially caught up to them, and now they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, as it were. So to take it back to Ryan's original question, the reason that conservatives and libertarian-leaning individuals need to be more engaged in this space, and why this issue should matter so much more to them than it apparently does, is because this is your government at work. If you want to remain a free and secure country, then certainly the NSA and the FBI need the tools to prosecute criminals and malicious actors. But at the same time, if they're going to be charged with defending, Americans at home, and if they're going to be charged with essentially making sure that we're all secure from those criminals, then they probably shouldn't be the ones that are intentionally weakening the tools that those malicious actors could use against Americans. It's fundamentally an argument for a strong economy and a strong America.
It's interesting, over on the other side of Capitol Hill, the Senate may consider the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act as soon as today, which at some point may be reconciled with some similar but distinct legislation that the House passed earlier this year, all aimed at making us safer from cyber attacks by facilitating information sharing, even as we're seeing the administration take a skeptical stance toward the use of some of the technologies that in fact can prevent the sort of cyber attacks that we're trying to make less common. Amie, from a law enforcement investigation standpoint, of course the argument has been made that encryption presents a roadblock. There are certainly situations in which one can imagine how that might be the case. What sort of tools do government officials have to investigate and prosecute crimes when encryption is used by suspects? And what alternatives are there to insisting that encryption be weakened?
The great thing is the FBI is claiming that it is going dark. Professor Peter Swire actually coined the term, we're actually in the golden age of surveillance. If you think about how much data you generate just individually every single day, it's astounding. There's so much information out there about you that has never been out there about you previously. And that's not only true for ordinary people, it's also true for criminals or terrorists or people that law enforcement may want to go after. There's a ton of information. And so the idea that encryption is going to halt these investigations is slightly disingenuous. There are multiple ways to get at the information that we are seeing law enforcement need in order to pursue its duties. So to take a slight step back, we actually don't see this as a privacy versus security issue. We would argue that most issues are not privacy versus security issues, that it's actually a matter of trying to figure out how to raise both specters at the same time. But this specifically, we're actually looking at encryption as a necessary prerequisite for individual safety. There has been a great article recently in Slate written by Kevin Bankston that demonstrates that encryption actually lowers device theft. You are less likely to have your phone stolen or your computer stolen if a criminal thinks it's encrypted, because they will not think that they can use it in the way that they would want to use it. So it actually lowers those crime statistics. It makes data breaches less likely or less possible because it protects the information within databases. Overall, it is what keeps people safe as a whole. And the benefits for encryption so strongly outweigh any potential risks, mostly because of other ways to get at this information. Most people, if you have an iPhone, have your iCloud backup turned on. That means that it is being stored even if your device is encrypted and police cannot get at the data on the device itself. They can go to the Apple iCloud and they can get it there. So Apple still has access to that data. There are other parties to communications. So if you have an email and you're communicating with another party, the same way human intelligence has worked forever, police can go to the other party and not necessarily to the provider and get access to those communications that way. And then there is the ever interesting metadata issue. Technologists have not yet found a really good way of encrypting your metadata. So all of your location information, all of the information about who you're contacting, when you're contacting them, what device you're using to contact them, all of that is kind of roaming out there in unencrypted format. And police believe that they can actually get that on a lower standard of evidence than they believe they can get the content of your communications that may be encrypted anyway. And that information, I think experts agree, by and large, is so much more useful to law enforcement than any of the content, mainly because your metadata doesn't lie. You can write an email that has incorrect information in the email, but the information about where you sent it from and who you're sending it to, that can't be faked, really. So that information is there and unencrypted and provides a really great tool for law enforcement to use without having to undermine encryption. And the last thing I want to say is positive steps that Congress can take in order to ensure that encryption is able to be developed and used in a way that keeps people secure. Ryan mentioned the NSA's competing missions, signals intelligence, which is abbreviated to SIGINT, information assurance, that's IA, because if you abbreviated it in the same way that you abbreviated signals intelligence, it would cause a stir. It's a matter of making sure those two missions in the NSA are kept slightly separate, that one mission is not able to overrun the other mission. There have been bills and amendments proposed to make sure that the NSA's signals intelligence mission cannot act against its other mission in a way that degrades security. They can only act in a way that will support security support security. The other thing that you can do is pass incentives to use encryption. Ryan mentioned the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. We actually think that cybersecurity is incredibly important, that Congress should do a lot of things to protect cybersecurity, but that CISA or the House versions of CISA are not necessarily the answer for a lot of reasons. They provide overbroad immunity, and they don't necessarily get to the information that's going to be the most helpful to combating cyber threats. And in fact, they get to a lot more information, and they provide for, almost unanimously, these bills provide for instantaneous sharing of that information with the NSA and other national security agencies. So it creates a new means for NSA surveillance. So we don't think that those bills are necessarily the answer, but there are cybersecurity proposals that can promote security and can promote encryption. And I'll leave it there.
When we talk about this encrypted information being inaccessible, of course, it's not actually inaccessible. Even if, say, a provider or an operating system manufacturer can't access it, if the information is usable, at least one person has to be able to figure out what is in that encrypted container, and that is the user, the creator, the owner of the information, sometimes the recipient of an encrypted transfer. So someone generally is going to know the key, the passcode that lets you access the unencrypted data. Jonathan, in light of this, of course, law enforcement and government officials can get that from the individual, at least in theory. In practice, that could obviously be somewhat difficult. My old computer crime professor, Orrin Kerr, has proposed that the Volokh conspiracy, creating a new federal crime, a willful refusal to decrypt. Of course, already perhaps individuals can and have been charged with contempt of court. Can you talk about what happens if the government wants to get either your encryption key or the decrypted data from you, and what they can do already and what some have proposed they should be able to do?
Supposing law enforcement has seized, let's suppose, an iPhone from a suspect and wants to compel that suspect to unlock their iPhone, either through a subpoena or through a warrant, and then use a supplementary order under the All Writs Act. And aside on the All Writs Act, by the way, if you see people freaking out about this thing, which sometimes they do, it's actually like a pretty normal mechanism for compelling assistance with a warrant. I think reasonable minds can absolutely disagree on whether the policy should be government allowing a certain degree of assistance, but as kind of a legal vehicle, it's clearly established you can use the All Writs Act that way. So those are the mechanisms law enforcement would use. Then those mechanisms run up against the Fifth Amendment privilege against compelled self-incriminating testimony. Legal scholars debate this ad nauseum. Courts, I think, are starting to settle out in a somewhat reasonable place on the issue. The kind of rough contours are the government can't force you to give out a password, passcode, PIN, anything like that. Right? So if the subpoena says you have to testify what your password is, that's going to get trumped by the Fifth Amendment. if the government says, we want you to use your thumbprint to unlock a device, that's not testimony. It's not covered by the Fifth Amendment. So that's also kind of a clear case where, or I should say, a case where the law is clear, and it is the government can compel that. Where the law gets murky is in requiring someone to unlock their device, not actually provide the passcode to do that. But the government will say, here's a copy of the data, we're going to send you into a room, come back out with an unlocked copy. And the law is kind of, courts agree that there is a test to apply about where if the government has some idea of what the data looks like, then the government can compel decryption. The area of law, if you're curious, is called the foregone conclusion doctrine. And if the government doesn't know what the data looks like whatsoever, generally the government can't get at it. The kind of tussle in the courts right now is on the level of generality. So the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court has said, if the government knows this is your phone and you're probably engaged in this sort of criminal enterprise, that's enough. It can be, the suspect can be compelled to unlock their phone. At least one court of appeals and some lower courts have said, no, much more level of specificity is required. The government may not have to know like specific file names or what's in photos or so on, but they need some kind of rough sketch. So anyway, that's where the law is on that issue. Presumably it'll continue to develop in the coming years.
Amie, you had mentioned the Save Crypto campaign. Of course, the administration recently decided to, I think, opt not to pursue legislation to weaken encryption. You learned that both from Washington Post and more from a National Security Council memo, which laid out 3 approaches the administration could take, essentially stand up for encryption, take a stance for legislation against it, or essentially punt the issue, which is what it opted to do. How do you think the recent advocacy efforts that your organization and others have spearheaded are affecting the debate about this issue? And what do you think the prospects are for pushing back against attempts to weaken encryption? And to add one more thing, what are your thoughts on the behind the scenes and public pressure, what some might call the threat sort of Damocles, that if companies don't comply with the government's requests voluntarily, that they may be pressured to do so through courts or legislatively?
Sure. So the same day, actually a couple weeks ago, that James Comey testified that the administration would not be seeking legislation. So what we saw as kind of a punt on the encryption issue, a court in the Southern District of New York actually released an order that explained that the Department of Justice had filed a motion under the All Writs Act, which is why people are mostly talking about it right now, to compel Apple to decrypt a iPhone, a specific device. And the court expressed hesitancy that such an action would fall under the guise of the All Writs Act, but asked Apple to go back and to provide a more in-depth briefing on what the technical problems would be with requiring this action to take place. So right now we're in a stance where we're waiting for Apple to file a motion in response to this court's order. But really, we got this weird mixed message where we have FBI Director Comey standing up and saying we're not going to seek legislation on this issue to require vulnerabilities. Instead, we're going to go to the court to try to require vulnerabilities. That is one of the reasons why we think it's really important to have a proactive, positive statement on the record saying that encryption is necessary and we shouldn't undermine it. The administration, both the president and Director Comey, started out this really kind of robust encryption debate at the beginning of the year by saying we need to have a public conversation. This was kind of the talking point for a really long time. We don't know if it's possible to undermine encryption for one person without undermining it for everybody. We should have a public conversation. And we heard this again and again and again. We kind of started to have a public conversation. Access actually hosted a summit on cryptography in July. We brought a lot of technologists, a lot of people from the corporate sector, a lot of government representatives together to have a public conversation. At about the same time that the talking point moved from we should have a public conversation to we're having a lot of secret meetings with companies, and they're kind of going okay. And so now you hear about these like kind of private off-the-record meetings, and it's really kind of taken a lot of the public knowledge out of what is happening right now. They are not forthcoming with who they're meeting with, how those meetings are going, what is being asked of companies, or how companies are responding. So there's no real knowledge about where this conversation is internally to the administration right now. What we do have is this filing in the Southern District of New York and some statements from Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, saying that, reiterating frequently, actually, that he is not going to undermine Apple products in response to the government. So it's a little unclear where that messaging is right now from the White House, because the mixed signals are coming kind of from every different direction. We have a Washington Post story that reiterates James Comey's comments, followed a few days later by a New York Times story that seems to be a little bit more proactive. We will not seek legislation or force companies to undermine their vulnerabilities, but had incredibly confusing language on it. I work on this issue more or less every single day. I read that story at least 5 or 6 times, and I can tell you I have no idea what point that the author of that story was trying to get across, and I'm not totally sure if they knew. It seemed like it was thrown together potentially in response to the Southern District of New York opinion to try to solidify that this is not necessarily administrative policy. The problem without a positive statement is that these actions can continue to happen. If you go back to the 90s and to the CALEA law, when CALEA was passed, it's the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which is what requires that all telephone calls be wiretappable, that they have to build the structure in a way that law enforcement can gain access to it. Initially, there was written in, and there's actually still written in, an exception for internet companies. That exception really needs to be expanded in a way that says not only does CALEA not apply, but you cannot backdoor technologies generally in a way that affects the population as a whole. Without that, you're going to continue to see the FBI trying to implement these vulnerabilities in a way that it has done every single year for at least the last 5 years. And every single year we have the same conversation. And every single year we kind of agree that it's not technically feasible, and the FBI backs down until the next year. Without a proactive statement, we're going to continue to have these conversations. And you're going to continue to hear people say the exact same things that we're saying here today. And we'll keep kind of beating it back, but we're not going to be able to cease having the conversations. They're going to keep pushing for them. And CALEA made phones insecure. If you look at the phone system today, the fact that our phone calls are wiretappable actually has led indirectly to the fact that I can, for relatively cheaply, buy technology online and put it together in a way that I can basically listen to anybody's phone calls. Our communications telephone infrastructure is very weak. It's very insecure. Luckily, up until this point, we have not had to build the internet in a way to make it equally insecure, but you can see all of that change. And we can see an internet in 5 or 10 years that actually is built on vulnerabilities, and where you can never be sure who is gaining access to your communications, because there's going to be ways to get into those communications that normal individuals are going to be able to exploit.
Any thoughts or comments from any of you that you'd like to add to?
Yes, I want to amplify Amy's point about the current dispute about the All Writs Act. The DOJ's position has long been that it already has authority to compel backdoors in products, and that it simply has not sought to use that authority, and it doesn't necessarily have sufficient remedies to make sure that authority is exercised. The specific sources of authority are the All Writs Act for stored data, and then the Electronic Communications Privacy Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act for data in motion. The All Writs Act is a catch-all for helping with warrants, and then ECBA and FISA actually have specific statutory provisions for assistance with a wiretap order or a pen register order, which is dealing with metadata surveillance. The courts have not really chimed in on the limits of each of these. And those limits do in many ways look very similar to the policy debate. It's like it can't be excessively burdensome or as much as necessary. And so there's certainly an opportunity for clarifying that wherever those limits are, they don't include backdoors. DOJ, has its view, but that view has thus far at least not been affirmed by any court.
Yeah, and just to add, the conversation is moving into the world of what is permissible in the terms of government hacking. We're already seeing this conversation take place in the UK. They published a document earlier this year that says that they think that they can, what they call interfere with your tools or technologies in a way that could have a huge impact. There is a rule of evidence that is being changed, Rule 41, on evidence gathering, that will allow potentially, or at least kind of seem to bless government hacking for law enforcement. And it's not a conversation that is being actively had in Congress or elsewhere. These rules are kind of being pushed through very quietly and in obscure meetings and settings, and nobody's really talking about that yet. So when you talk about undermining encryption, the logical next conversation to have is, what is the extent that we want to give law enforcement the power to hack into our devices, and when is that appropriate? And I want to flag for all of you that that conversation is coming and to be ready for it.
Thank you very much, and we'll have the video of this available on CEI.org sometime soon.